In 1958, a ship that survived 6 kamikaze strikes, 3 Japanese claims of her own sinking, and every major carrier battle of the Pacific War was cut into pieces by a scrap contractor in New Jersey. Her name was Enterprise. The Navy called her CV-6. Her crew called her the Big E. She earned 20 battle stars in the Second World War. No other American warship in history has matched that number. Not before her. Not since. Britain saved HMS Belfast. Japan tried to save what little remained of her wartime fleet. America built museums for Yorktown, for Midway, for Intrepid, carriers with less combat history than the ship that came before them. Enterprise got none of that. She got a 14-year fight for survival that a private committee could not win, a Congress that would not write the check, and a Navy that classified her as surplus tonnage, the same bureaucratic label given to a rusted landing craft or a decommissioned tugboat. In 1958, she was sold for scrap for $561,333. That is less than half of 1% of what it cost to build her. This is the story of how the most decorated ship in American naval history came within a signature of becoming a national monument, and how that signature never came. In 1933, the United States Navy was still operating under the limits of the Washington Naval Treaty, a set of international rules that capped how much carrier tonnage any nation could build. But by 1934, President Franklin Roosevelt had signed the Vinson-Trammell Act, a law that authorized the Navy to build up to treaty limits for the first time since the treaty was signed. America was rearming at sea, and it needed platforms to carry the aircraft that admirals increasingly believed would decide the next war. The order for Enterprise was placed under that authority. Her keel was laid on July 16, 1934, at the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Virginia, the same yard that had built battleships for the Navy since the turn of the century. She was the 6th aircraft carrier in American history and the 3rd of the Yorktown class, a design built around a single core idea: speed and aircraft capacity over armor. Her statistics were, for 1934, extraordinary. She displaced roughly 19,800 tons standard, a number that would nearly double the tonnage of carriers built just a decade earlier. She stretched 809 feet from bow to stern, powered by mine boilers driving 4 steam turbines that could push her past 32 knots, fast enough to keep pace with the cruisers and destroyers that would screen her in battle. Her flight deck could handle a full air group of over 90 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, launched and recovered from a single unarmored wooden deck laid over a steel hull. That last detail mattered more than anyone knew in 1934. Yorktown-class carriers carried almost no armor protection on their flight decks. The entire design philosophy rested on a gamble that a carrier's best defense was never being hit at all, because her aircraft would sink the enemy first. It was a gamble that would nearly kill her more than once in the years ahead. She was launched on October 3, 1936, sponsored by Lulu Swift Hepburn, the daughter of a former chief of the Bureau of Navigation. She was commissioned into active service on May 12, 1938, under the command of Captain Newton H. White, Jr. At that moment, Enterprise was simply the newest ship in a peacetime fleet, one carrier among a handful the United States possessed. Nobody watching her slide into the water at Newport News could have known that within 4 years she would become the single most important warship in the Pacific, because within 4 years, every other carrier that outranked her would be gone. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Enterprise should have been at Pearl Harbor. She had spent the week prior delivering Marine Corps fighter planes to Wake Island, a routine reinforcement mission under the command of Vice Admiral William Halsey. Her task force was due back in port on the evening of December 6, but rough seas had slowed her escorting destroyers during refueling, pushing her return by roughly a full day. That delay saved her. At 7:48 the next morning, Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. Enterprise was still at sea, roughly 200 miles west of Oahu. Her air group was airborne that morning, flying ahead to Ford Island, and they arrived directly into the attack, some of the first American aircraft to engage the enemy that day. Several of her pilots were shot down over the harbor they had been sent to land in. By the time Enterprise herself reached port that evening, the battleship fleet she had trained alongside for years, Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, was sunk or burning at anchor. Of the Pacific Fleet's 3 aircraft carriers, only Enterprise and Lexington were within striking range that week. Saratoga was on the west coast. The mathematics of the Pacific War changed in a single morning. America's battleship line, the force every pre-war naval doctrine had been built around, was gone. What remained to carry the fight forward were carriers, and there were barely 3 of them. Enterprise was no longer just one carrier among several. She was, for the first weeks of the war, 1/3 of everything the United States Navy had left in the Pacific capable of striking back. Nobody planned for that. It was an accident of timing, a delayed refueling, a late return to port, but it placed Enterprise at the center of a war she had not yet fired a shot in, and it began 4 years in which she would rarely leave the front line again. By June 1942, American codebreakers had done what no fleet of battleships could. They had read Japan's intentions and knew that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was sending his carrier force to seize Midway Atoll, a speck of coral and airstrip nearly 1,300 miles from Pearl Harbor. Admiral Chester Nimitz had exactly 3 carriers to meet 4 Japanese flat tops that were, on paper, faster, better protected, and crewed by pilots who had not lost a major fleet battle in the war so far. Enterprise was one of the 3. On the morning of June 4th, her dive bombers, Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft, single-engine planes built to drop a single bomb from a near-vertical dive, launched into uncertainty. Fuel was tight. The Japanese carriers had not been located precisely. Squadrons from Enterprise, flying under Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, found the enemy fleet almost by accident, following the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the main force. What followed took 6 minutes. Dive bombers from Enterprise in Yorktown struck 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, in nearly simultaneous attacks, catching them mid-refueling and mid-rearming, their decks crowded with fuel lines and armed aircraft. All 3 burned and eventually sank. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, was found and destroyed by Enterprise's aircraft later that same day, after Hiryu's own planes had already crippled Yorktown. In a single day, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 4 fleet carriers and the core of its trained air crews. The United States lost 1. Historians have called it the turning point of the Pacific War. Enterprise's air group played a direct role in sinking 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers destroyed that day. There was no time to celebrate. Within weeks, Enterprise was steaming toward Guadalcanal, where the Marine Corps had landed to seize an airstrip in the Solomon Islands, and Japan was determined to take it back. The waters around Guadalcanal became one of the most contested naval battlegrounds of the war, and Enterprise fought through nearly all of it. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, she was hit by 3 bombs, killing 74 crewmen and tearing a hole in her flight deck, and she cut flying aircraft within hours, her damage control teams patching the deck while the ship remained in the fight. At the Battle of Santa Cruz in October, with the American carrier force reduced to Enterprise alone after Hornet was lost, she absorbed further bomb damage and still launched the strikes that helped turn back the Japanese fleet. For a period of weeks that autumn, Enterprise was the only operational American aircraft carrier in the entire Pacific Ocean. It was during this stretch, battered, patched with steel plate and timber, refusing to leave the line, that her crew and the press began calling her the Big E. The nickname was not born from ceremony. It was born from the fact that she would not stop fighting, even when she was, by any technical measure, the last one standing. By the end of 1942, Enterprise had taken more damage than most carriers in the fleet would see in the entire war. She had also done more to keep that fleet alive than any single ship in the Pacific. Japanese radio propaganda claimed to have sunk Enterprise on 3 separate occasions during the war. American sailors in the Pacific Fleet began referring to her, half joking, as the ship the Japanese sank most, each time she returned to action. The pattern had already started at Santa Cruz in October 1942 when Japanese pilots who watched bombs strike her deck and smoke pour from her hull reported her destroyed. She was back in combat operations within weeks. It repeated in 1943 as she supported the island-hopping campaign through the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, and again in 1944 during the campaign for the Marianas, where her aircraft took part in what American pilots nicknamed the Marianas Turkey Shoot, a lopsided air battle in which Japan lost hundreds of aircraft and the core of its remaining trained naval pilots in a single afternoon. By 1945, Enterprise had become something rarer than a survivor. She had become a fixture, one of the only pre-war carriers still on the front line after 4 years of combat, that had sunk most of the ships she had commissioned alongside. The war's final months brought the threat that came closest to finishing her. In the spring of 1945, during the campaign for Okinawa, Japan turned to kamikaze attacks on a scale not seen earlier in the war. Aircraft deliberately flown into ships, a tactic built on the calculation that a plane loaded with explosives and no pilot expecting to survive could do more damage than conventional bombing runs against increasingly effective American anti-aircraft defenses. On May 14, 1945, a single kamikaze aircraft struck Enterprise near her forward elevator. The explosion hurled the elevator platform, a section of steel weighing many tons, roughly 400 feet into the air. 14 crewmen were killed. The damage was severe enough that Enterprise was withdrawn from combat for the remainder of the war, the injury that finally took her out of the fight, 3.5 years after Pearl Harbor. And after nearly every major carrier battle the Pacific War had produced, she never returned to combat before Japan's surrender in August 1945. When the final accounting was done, Enterprise had earned 20 battle stars, a formal Navy award recognizing participation in a major named engagement or campaign. No other ship in the history of the United States Navy has matched that total, before or since. She had taken part in essentially every major carrier action the Pacific War produced: Pearl Harbor's aftermath, Midway, the Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, the Gilbert and Marshall campaigns, the Marianas, and the closing kamikaze campaign off Okinawa. She had also survived being reported sunk by enemy radio, absorbed bomb and kamikaze strikes that killed well over 100 of her own crew across the war, and remained, at the moment of Japan's surrender, one of the most storied warships afloat anywhere in the world. In September 1945, she carried occupation troops into Japanese waters, and later ferried American servicemen home from Europe as part of Operation Magic Carpet, one last mission of transport rather than combat. The war, finally, completely over. What nobody on her deck that autumn could have predicted was that the next 13 years of her existence would be harder to survive than any kamikaze attack had been. War fleets are built for war. When the war ends, the fleet becomes a budget line. By 1946, the United States Navy possessed more aircraft carriers than it would need for the rest of the century. Dozens of fleet and escort carriers built for a two-ocean war against Japan and Germany now sat in port with no enemy left to fight. Congress, facing pressure to shrink wartime spending and convert the economy back to peacetime footing, was in no mood to fund the upkeep of a fleet built for a conflict that no longer existed. Enterprise, despite her record, was not exempt from that arithmetic. Her design was, by 1946, already a decade old. Newer, larger carriers, the Midway class, built too late to see combat but engineered around lessons the war itself had taught, represented the future the Navy wanted to fund. An aging Yorktown-class carrier, however decorated, represented the past. In early 1947, Enterprise was decommissioned and placed in the reserve fleet, the informal name for the ships mothballed at Navy yards along the East Coast, preserved in a state of suspended animation in case they were ever needed again. Her flight deck, which had launched the aircraft that helped sink 4 Japanese carriers at Midway, sat empty. Her hangar bays, once crowded with dauntless dive bombers and Wildcat fighters, were sealed and dehumidified to slow corrosion. Her guns were covered. Her crew, the men who had fought her through Guadalcanal and Okinawa, were reassigned or discharged. She was, on paper, Simply one more hull in a reserve fleet that by the late 1940s contained hundreds of ships, destroyers, cruisers, carriers, all preserved at public expense on the chance a future war might require them. But Enterprise was not simply another hull, and a small group of people who had served aboard her, or who had followed her record through the war, believed the Navy and the country owed her something more than mothballs and a possible future recall to service. That belief was about to collide directly with the economics of post-war Washington, and for the next 11 years, it would not stop colliding. The effort to save Enterprise did not come from the Navy. It came from the people who had served on her. In 1947, veterans of her wartime crew, together with civilian supporters who had followed her combat record in the newspapers, organized what became known as the Enterprise Association, a private committee with a single goal: raise enough money to purchase the ship from the Navy and preserve her as a permanent memorial, a floating museum honoring both the ship and the sailors who had fought aboard her. The goal was ambitious from the start. The Navy would not simply donate a warship. It expected to be paid something close to fair value, and the committee needed to raise funds large enough to cover purchase, towing, berthing, and the ongoing cost of maintaining a 25,000-ton steel hull against rust, weather, and time. The committee's approach mirrored what was at the same moment happening on the other side of the Atlantic and across the Pacific. In Britain, campaigns were underway to preserve warships with strong combat records as permanent memorials, efforts that would eventually succeed with ships like HMS Belfast, saved and opened to the public as a museum ship. In Japan, there was a public sentiment, though far more complicated given the political weight of preserving a former Imperial Navy vessel, to keep some physical reminder of the fleet that had fought the war. Preserving a decorated warship as a national monument was not a fringe idea in the late 1940s and 1950s. It was something other nations were actively doing with ships that, in several cases, had far less combat history than Enterprise. The Enterprise Association's fundraising ran through the early 1950s on donations, veteran association drives, and public appeals, letters to newspapers, requests routed through naval history societies, campaigns aimed at both former crew and the broader public who remembered her name from wartime headlines. But the effort ran into a problem inherent to any preservation campaign built on public sentiment. Sentiment does not scale to the cost of steel maintenance. Keeping a carrier the size of Enterprise afloat and structurally sound is not a one-time expense. It requires continuous funding for hull maintenance, corrosion control, dry docking, staffing, and berthing fees, costs that recur every year the ship exists, regardless of how much money has already been raised. The committee needed not just a purchase price, but an endowment large enough to sustain the ship indefinitely. And by the mid-1950s, it had raised only a fraction of what full preservation would require. Meanwhile, the Navy's patience for the arrangement had limits. Reserve fleet ships occupied berths, required minimal but non-zero maintenance, even in mothballs, and represented, in the Navy's own budget language, tonnage that could eventually be reassigned, sold, or scrapped, depending on need. The Navy was willing to let the preservation effort attempt to raise its funds. It was not willing to fund the preservation itself, and it was not willing to hold the ship indefinitely, while a private committee continued to fall short of its target. By 1956, the shortfall was severe enough that the committee's own leadership began to recognize the campaign was losing its race against time. Congress had been approached for direct appropriation, public funding that would have closed the gap and secured the ship's future by act of law, the same mechanism that would later save other historic vessels. Congress declined. There was no political urgency behind saving a decommissioned carrier, a decade after the war it had fought in, and no single member of Congress was willing to spend political capital pushing an appropriation through a body focused on Cold War defense budgets, not naval memorials. The campaign was not without hope. It had raised real money, generated real public attention, and secured statements of support from prominent former Navy officers who had served during the war. But statements of support do not purchase a ship, and the clock the Navy had quietly started running in its own budget planning was about to reach its end. By 1956, the Navy's Bureau of Ships had begun the internal process of classifying the reserve fleet for disposal, a routine budgetary exercise that for most ships meant nothing more than paperwork. For Enterprise, it meant the Preservation Committee now had a deadline it had not been told existed. The decision to let Enterprise go was never made by a single villain in a single meeting. It was made, slowly, by an entire budget process that had no mechanism built into it for sentiment. By the mid-1950s, the United States Navy was operating under Cold War priorities that had nothing to do with honoring the last war. The service was investing in supercarriers, in nuclear propulsion research, in jet-capable flight decks that Enterprise's 1930s design could never accommodate, even if she had been recommissioned. Every dollar spent maintaining a mothballed World War II-era carrier in reserve was, in the Navy's internal accounting, a dollar not spent on the ships the next war would actually require. The reserve fleet was reviewed regularly for exactly this reason, and ships with no active military function and no funded path to preservation were, by policy, candidates for disposal. From the Navy's perspective, the logic was not personal and not dismissive of her record. It was procedural. The service was legally permitted to sell surplus vessels, and Congress had never appropriated funds earmarking Enterprise, specifically, for a different fate. Without a specific act of Congress protecting her, she was treated administratively the same as any other hull the reserve fleet no longer required, regardless of how many battle stars she carried. Congress, for its part, had been petitioned more than once. Members of the Enterprise Association and supportive veterans groups had lobbied for a direct appropriation that would fund her preservation outright, bypassing the shortfall in private fundraising entirely. But by 1956 and into 1957, Congress was consumed by defense budgets shaped by the early space race, the buildup of strategic nuclear forces, and the costs of Cold War military commitments across Europe and Asia. A one-time appropriation to preserve a decommissioned carrier from the previous war competed for attention against budget lines that members of Congress considered current national security priorities. No sponsor emerged in either chamber willing to push the appropriation through committee, and without a sponsor, the request never reached a vote. There was also a legal and financial reality working against the committee that had nothing to do with politics. Government surplus property law required that vessels no longer needed by the Navy be disposed of in a manner that recovered value for the taxpayer, typically through public sale to the highest bidder. A private preservation committee could compete for that sale, but only by matching or exceeding what a scrap contractor was willing to pay for the raw steel tonnage of a ship her size. And scrap contractors by 1957 were offering real money for a hull built from tens of thousands of tons of wartime steel. The Enterprise Association had, by this point, raised a substantial sum from donations and public appeals. It was not enough. Estimates of the total preservation cost, purchase, towing, berthing, and the reserve fund needed to maintain her indefinitely as a public memorial ran well beyond what years of veteran-led fundraising had managed to collect. The committee asked for an extension. The Navy, under its own disposal timeline and facing continued reserve fleet maintenance cost, with no guarantee the fundraising would ever close the gap, was not willing to grant one indefinitely. In 1958, the Navy set a final deadline for the preservation campaign to complete its purchase. The committee could not meet it. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation. There was no single hearing, no single vote, no single official who could be named as the person who killed the Big E. There was only a deadline that passed, a shortfall that never closed, and a routine disposal process that, absent congressional intervention, proceeded exactly as it was designed to. On July 1, 1958, the United States Navy sold Enterprise to the Lipset division of Luria Brothers, a scrap metal contractor based in New York, for $561,333. The number is worth sitting with. Enterprise had cost the Navy approximately $19 million to build in the 1930s. Adjusted for nothing, not even inflation, the ship that had helped win the Pacific War was sold for less than 3% of what it cost to build her. As raw tonnage, priced by the pound, she was worth more broken apart than she was worth preserved. The Preservation Committee's final appeals arrived too late to matter. Letters were sent to the Navy Department and to members of Congress in the weeks before the sale, asking for one last extension, one last chance to close the funding gap. Newspaper editorials in several cities noted the irony of scrapping the most decorated ship in American naval history, while other nations were successfully preserving warships with lesser records. None of it changed the outcome. The contract had already been signed. The disposal process the Navy had set in motion 2 years earlier reached its conclusion exactly on schedule. In May 1958, before the sale was even finalized, tugboats had already begun towing Enterprise from the reserve fleet anchorage toward the scrapyard at Kearney, New Jersey. There was no ceremony, no honor guard, no band on the pier. The ship that had carried the aircraft that helped sink 4 Japanese carriers at Midway, that had absorbed bomb strikes at the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, that had taken a kamikaze strike off Okinawa, and kept fighting until the war's final months, was pulled through the water by tugboats to a yard where cutting torches were waiting. Demolition began later that year and continued into 1960. Workers cut through the same flight deck that had launched hundreds of combat sorties, the same hangar bays that had once held dauntless dive bombers and Wildcat fighters, the same hull that Japanese radio had claimed to have sunk 3 times without success. What the Imperial Japanese Navy could not accomplish in 4 years of war, a scrap contractor completed in roughly 2 years of methodical cutting. A small number of her fittings were saved before demolition. Her bell, several plaques, and pieces of her superstructure preserved separately by veterans groups, and later displayed at naval museums and installations. It was not the ship. It was what remained of her, salvaged in fragments, after the whole had already been lost. By 1960, USS Enterprise, CV-6, the Big E, holder of 20 battle stars, the most decorated warship in the history of the United States Navy, no longer existed. There was no wreck to dive, no hull to visit, no ship to walk the deck of and read the names of the men who had died aboard her. There was only steel, sold by weight, melted down and repurposed into products that had nothing to do with the war she had helped win. Enterprise did not disappear without consequence. Her loss became the argument that saved every carrier that came after her. Within a decade of her scrapping, the preservation movement in the United States had learned exactly what had gone wrong. Private committees alone, running on veteran donations and public sentiment, could not raise enough money fast enough to outbid a scrap contractor working against a Navy disposal deadline. What was needed instead was a faster transfer of ownership to a state or municipal authority, backed by tax-exempt nonprofit status, secured before a firm deadline forced a competitive sale. That lesson was applied almost immediately. In 1968, when the Navy declared the carrier Yorktown, herself a decorated Pacific War veteran, surplus, the state of South Carolina moved quickly to acquire her for what became Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum, avoiding the drawn-out private fundraising race that had doomed Enterprise. In 1982, New York City and a dedicated nonprofit foundation secured the carrier Intrepid before she could be sold for scrap, opening her permanently on the Hudson River as the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum. In 1992, the carrier Midway was saved through a similar model, becoming a museum ship in San Diego. Each of these campaigns cited Enterprise by name as the case study in what not to do. The ship that had proven private fundraising alone was not enough, and that speed and institutional backing mattered as much as public sentiment. The historical verdict on Enterprise's loss is not complicated. She was, by every combat metric the Navy itself used to measure a warship's record, the most accomplished carrier the United States had ever put to sea. 20 battle stars. Participation in nearly every major carrier engagement of the Pacific War, a record that, when compared side by side with the ships that were later successfully preserved, was equal to or greater than all of them. What she lacked was not merit, it was timing, and it was the institutional mechanism to convert merit into protection. The Preservation Committee that tried to save her did everything a private group in the 1940s and 1950s knew how to do, and it was not enough, because the system had not yet been built to let sentiment move as fast as a disposal deadline. Enterprise was, in that sense, the mistake that made every later success possible. Yorktown, Intrepid, and Midway exist today, in part, because the people who saved them had watched Enterprise disappear, and refuse to repeat the same fight the same way. There is a museum on the Hudson River today, where visitors can walk the flight deck of a Pacific war carrier, stand where pilots once launched into combat, and read the names of the men who served. There is no equivalent place for Enterprise. There is only a bell, a handful of plaques, and a record in the National Archives listing 20 battle stars next to a ship that no longer exists anywhere except in that record. If you want to see what full-scale carrier preservation looks like when it succeeds, the stories of Intrepid and Yorktown are next. Two ships that survived, in part, because Enterprise did not.